Have you ever noticed how some people can be in a crowded room and still feel completely alone? How they can be surrounded by love and yet struggle to believe it's real? There's something strange about children who grew up shuttling between two homes, two lives, two versions of reality. They learn to read rooms before they learn to read books. They become fluent in the language of adult emotions before they understand their own. They master the art of disappearing while standing right in front of you. And here's the paradox. They're often the most adaptable people you'll ever meet, and yet they struggle with something as simple as feeling like they belong anywhere at all. So what happens in the mind of a child who grows up with separate parents? And why do the effects echo through their entire lives in ways most people never see? Picture this. You're 7 years old, and you have 2 bedrooms, 2 sets of rules, 2 morning routines, 2 versions of normal. At mom's house, bedtime is 8:30. At dad's house, it's 9. At mom's house, you fold your clothes. At dad's house, they go in a pile. Neither is wrong. Neither is right. But you're somewhere in between, constantly translating, constantly adjusting, constantly shape-shifting to fit the space you're in. This is what psychologists call code switching, but it goes far deeper than behavior. It's identity switching. And when you're young, when your sense of self is still forming, this creates something profound, a fragmented core. Child development research shows us that children build their sense of self through mirroring. They see themselves reflected in their parents' eyes, in the consistency of their environment, in the predictability of their world. But what happens when that mirror keeps changing? When the person you are at mom's house doesn't quite match the person you are at dad's house? You learn to become whoever you need to be to keep the peace. Here's the truth. Children of separate parents become emotional translators long before their brains are ready for the job. They learn to read the tension in a handoff at the curb. They decode the meaning behind, "How was your time with your father?" They understand that the question isn't really about them. It's about the unfinished business between 2 adults who couldn't make it work. And this is where it gets complex. Research on child psychology shows that kids as young as 4 can sense emotional discord in their environment. But children of divorce don't just sense it, they manage it. They become the buffer, the bridge, the peacekeeper. One study published in the Journal of Family Psychology found that children often take on a mediating role between parents, sometimes called parentification, where they essentially become the emotional caretaker for the adults who are supposed to be caring for them. But here's what's really happening. When a child's nervous system is constantly activated by the need to manage adult emotions, to prevent conflict, to read the room and adjust accordingly, they never fully develop their own emotional regulatory system. Instead, they develop what attachment theorists call a hypervigilant attachment style. You become so attuned to everyone else's feelings that you lose touch with your own. Let me tell you about one of the most painful psychological binds a child can experience: the loyalty conflict. You love your mother, you love your father, but loving one feels like betraying the other. Having fun at dad's house means feeling guilty at mom's house. Sharing a memory from mom's place means watching dad's face fall, even if he tries to hide it. The research on this is clear and heartbreaking. Dr. Mavis Hetherington, who conducted one of the longest longitudinal studies on divorce, found that children often feel caught between parents, and this feeling of being torn doesn't just cause stress. It fundamentally alters how they experience love itself. They learn that love is conditional, that it requires careful navigation, that you can't be fully yourself with anyone because full honesty means hurting someone you care about. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that the parents separated, but that the child learned to separate parts of themselves to survive it. Fast forward 20 years. That 7-year-old who learned to read rooms, they're now an adult who can't relax at parties. They're scanning faces, picking up micro-expressions, sensing shifts in energy that others miss entirely. It's a superpower and a curse. Neuroscience research on childhood stress shows us that when a developing brain is repeatedly exposed to unpredictable or emotionally charged environments, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes overactive. Mirror neurons, which help us understand and empathize with others, go into overdrive. You become so good at understanding everyone else that it becomes automatic, unconscious, exhausting. But here's the thing. You can't turn it off. Even when you're safe, even when there's no conflict to manage, even when no one needs you to be the emotional translator, you're still scanning, still adjusting, still preparing for the other shoe to drop. This is what therapists call hypervigilance, and for adults who grew up between two homes, it feels like normal. You don't realize you're doing it until someone points out that you apologize for things that aren't your fault, that you change your opinions based on who's in the room, that you struggle to answer simple questions like, "What do you want?" or "How do you feel?" because you spent your childhood asking those questions of everyone else, and no one thought to ask them of you. Here's where it gets really interesting. Children who grow up with separate parents often develop a fascinating relationship with commitment. On one hand, they crave stability desperately. They want a relationship that works, a home that feels permanent, a love that doesn't end. But on the other hand, they don't quite believe it's possible. Attachment research from Dr. John Bowlby's groundbreaking work tells us that children form internal working models of relationships based on their early experiences. If your first model of commitment showed you that love ends, that promises break, that forever has an expiration date, well, you carry that template into every relationship that follows. You might push people away before they can leave. You might cling too tightly, suffocating relationships with anxiety. You might keep one foot out the door, always ready for the inevitable ending. Or you might do all three, cycling through patterns of push and pull that confuse even you. And the cruelest part? You're often attracted to people who confirm your worst fears. Psychologists call this repetition compulsion, the unconscious tendency to recreate familiar dynamics, even painful ones, because at least they're predictable. But here's what people don't talk about. The silence, the things that didn't get said, the questions you learned not to ask. Do you still love each other? Was it my fault? Will you leave me too? Children of divorce become masters of unspoken communication. They learn that some topics are off limits, that some feelings are too big to express, that sometimes the safest thing to do is to say nothing at all and pretend everything is fine. But silence is not emptiness, it's control. It's the child who learned that their feelings might be too much, might tip the balance, might cause more problems in a family that's already fractured. So they swallow their sadness. They minimize their needs. They become eerily easy, remarkably low maintenance, impressively mature. And everyone calls them resilient. But the truth is, resilience and suppression can look identical from the outside. Now let me tell you something that might surprise you. There's a gift here too. And I'm not talking about the toxic positivity version where we pretend every wound is a blessing. I'm talking about the real, complicated truth that sometimes our deepest pain creates our greatest capacity. You learned to read people because you had to, but that means you understand human nature with a depth that others don't. You can sense what someone needs before they say it. You can hold space for complexity. You understand that people can love each other and still not be able to stay together. That good intentions don't always create good outcomes. That adults are flawed and struggling and doing their best with the tools they have. This is wisdom. Hard-earned, painful wisdom, but wisdom nonetheless. Research on post-traumatic growth shows us that some individuals don't just recover from difficult experiences, They develop capacities they wouldn't have otherwise. Greater empathy, deeper compassion, a nuanced understanding of human relationships that comes from navigating complexity at a young age. You learn to adapt, and that made you flexible in ways that serve you. You learned to manage difficult emotions, and that gave you emotional intelligence. You learned to survive transitions, and that made you capable of handling change that would devastate others. But, and this is crucial, acknowledging the gifts doesn't mean pretending there wasn't a cost. Here's what happens around age 30, or sometimes 40, or sometimes in the middle of your second serious relationship. The reckoning. That moment when you realize that the patterns you've been running on autopilot are patterns you don't actually want. When you recognize that the hypervigilance that protected you as a child is now preventing you from experiencing intimacy as an adult. This is what therapists call the awakening, and it's both painful and liberating. Because for the first time, you're not just reacting, you're choosing. You're seeing the mechanisms that have been running your life, and you're realizing you can reprogram them. You can learn that love doesn't have to be complicated, that your needs are not a burden, that you can be fully yourself with someone without driving them away. That conflict doesn't mean abandonment. That commitment can actually last. But the psychology behind this runs deeper than just cognitive understanding. Neuroplasticity research shows us that the brain can rewire itself at any age. Those neural pathways formed in childhood, the ones that fire with anxiety at the first sign of conflict, the ones that automatically shift your personality based on your environment, they can be changed. Not easily, not quickly, but genuinely. Through therapy, through conscious relationships, through the hard work of noticing your patterns and choosing differently, you can create new templates for love, new models for commitment, new ways of being that aren't based on survival, but on authenticity. Here's what no one tells children of divorce until they're adults processing it in therapy. It wasn't your job to hold your family together. It wasn't your responsibility to manage your parents' emotions. It wasn't your fault that you needed both of them and couldn't have them in the same room. It wasn't a sign of weakness that you struggled with transitions. It wasn't selfishness to want a different life. You were a child, and childhood is supposed to be about being protected, not about becoming the protector. The weight you carried? It was never meant for your shoulders. And this is where it gets really important. Recognizing this isn't about blaming your parents. Most parents who separate are doing the best they can with impossible circumstances. They're trying to protect you from worse pain, the pain of watching a toxic relationship, of living with constant conflict, of growing up in a home where love has died. But good intentions don't erase impact. Your parents can have done their best, and you can still have been affected. Both things can be true. So, what does the adult version look like? That child who grew up between two homes? Sometimes they're the friend who always remembers your birthday but forgets to mention their own struggles. The partner who's incredibly attuned to your moods but can't articulate their feelings. The colleague who mediates every conflict but avoids confrontation in their personal life. The person who seems to have it all together but battles a constant undercurrent of anxiety that they can't quite explain. They might struggle with feeling at home anywhere, not just physically, but existentially. They might have a tendency to keep parts of their life separate, friends who don't know each other, aspects of themselves that they don't share with anyone. They might excel at short-term relationships, but panic when things get serious. Or they might jump into commitment quickly, desperate to create the stability they never had. And here's what's fascinating. They often don't connect these patterns to their childhood until someone points it out. Because this is just how they've always been. This is normal. This is life. Except it doesn't have to be. Here's the truth that changes everything. Understanding your story doesn't mean being trapped by it. Recognizing why you are the way you are isn't about staying stuck. It's about creating choice where there was only reaction. You can honor that the child you were did what they needed to survive, and you can recognize that the adult you are now has different options. You can acknowledge the hypervigilance that protected you and gently teach your nervous system that it's safe to relax. You can appreciate the emotional intelligence you developed and set boundaries around using it constantly. The work isn't about erasing your past or pretending it didn't shape you. The work is about bringing consciousness to the unconscious patterns, about choosing your responses rather than being controlled by your conditioning, about healing the wounds that still ache even decades later. And maybe that's the real gift of this journey. Not that you went through it, but that you can use what you learned to build a life that's genuinely yours. Not a performance for mom, not a version for dad, not a translation for anyone else. Just you. Integrated, whole, belonging finally to yourself. Remember that child, shuttling between two homes, learning to read rooms, becoming whoever they needed to be. They're still in there. The 7-year-old who packed a bag every week. The teenager who learned to keep secrets. The young adult who struggled to believe love could last. But here's what they need you to know. You survived, not just physically, but emotionally. You made it through something that fundamentally changes how a person experiences the world, and you're still here, still trying, still capable of love, even though love once taught you about loss. That's not just resilience, that's courage. And the fact that you're watching this, seeking to understand yourself, willing to look at painful patterns and ask difficult questions, that's growth. That's healing. That's the moment where survival becomes transformation. You don't have to stay split between two worlds. You can create a third space, one that's entirely yours, one where all parts of you are welcome, one where you don't have to translate or adjust or disappear to be accepted. You can learn to feel at home in yourself, and maybe that's what you've been searching for all along. Not a place, not a person, but a sense of belonging that no separation can touch because it lives inside you. The child who grew up between two homes can become the adult who finally comes home to themselves, and that's a kind of wholeness worth every hard step of the journey.